Testing, should be working. How much that really bad? Working. It's working better. The only good communist is a communizer. It's just, pick it up. Vocals. Well, we'll go with this one. Let me know if it gets bad. Yep. Okay. Welcome everyone to the first ever Saturday reading stream. So, and this still isn't fine. I'm not reading that yet. I already said that. I'm being urged to read Mein Kampf. I will at some point. Obviously, I'm going to read it very critically. I'm not a Nazi. But today, I'm not. And for the Saturday stream for the time being, we've got something even better. That being Abram Leon's The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation. Now, for some context, this dude was a victim of the Holocaust. He was a Jewish Marxist. So, if you will, one could say, half jokingly, that he was indeed a Judeo-Bolshevik. That's a terrible thing to say. However, he left us this book, and I will just read the blurb. During the opening years of the 21st century, anti-Semitic venom and incidents of violent assault on Jews have begun spreading. They are not a historical aberration. They are fueled by today's capitalist crises and fracturing of the post-World War II imperialist order, described in recent decades as globalization. At every turning point in history, from antiquity through feudalism to capitalism's rise and the imperialist death throes of the past century, Jews have been targets of persecution, including the genocide cold-bloodedly touted by Hitler as the final solution. Why is Jew hatred still raising its ugly head? What are its class roots? Why is there no solution to the Jewish question under capitalism, just as there is no solution to other problems before humanity? Without revolutionary struggles that transform us as we fight to transform our world. Abram Leon was killed in October 1944 at age 26 in the Nazi gas chambers at Auschwitz. He left us this book to help answer those questions. So, let's just get into it. This will be the first book in a series on Israel, Palestine, and the Zionist Problem. So, let's get started. Large the introductions to the author and all that sort of stuff. Okay, the introduction. This is the introduction is written by another person named Dave Prince. So here we go. The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation, was completed by Abram Leon in 1942 in Belgium during the wartime occupation by Germany. As the twin slaughters of World War II and the Nazis' final solution were unfolding, Leon wrote the book to explain the foundations of Jew hatred in the imperialist epoch, as well as the road to its eradication. There is no solution to the Jewish question under capitalism, he said, just as there is no solution to other problems posed before humanity. Without profound social upheavals, revolutionary upheavals. Unless the deep roots of the Jewish question are eliminated, the effects cannot be eliminated. That fact of history, of the class struggle, has been confirmed and reconfirmed many times during the last 150 years as capitalism has become more and more dominant the world over. In addition to murderous pogroms across Eastern and Central Europe and Russia during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, 40% of the world's 16.6 million Jews were slaughtered between 1941 and 1945. That's 6 million human beings. Today, 75 years after the end of World War II, the world Jewish population is 14.5 million, still some 15% below what it had been when the war began. Over that same period, the overall population of the Earth has more than tripled. The Jewish question, a Marxist interpretation, is a contribution to understanding the place of the fight against Jew hatred as an integral part of the program and strategy of the revolutionary working movement. The book was written in the late 1930s and early 1940s. In the years, Leon became a central leader of the Belgian section of the Fourth International, the World Organization of Communist Parties, led by Leon Trotsky. Written in French, it was first published in that language in 1946 by Editions Pionniers in Paris. The English translation was published in 1950 by Pioneer Publishers, the forerunner of Pathfinder Press. The need for this new edition, in English and Spanish translations, as well as in French, was evident from the political contributions of workers and young people during debates that followed talks I was invited to give to a number of militant labour forums across the United States and Canada over the past several years. Some were organised as a political response to recent violence against Jews in North America and Europe, including murderous assaults on synagogues and kosher grocery stores, verbal and physical harassment of men wearing Jewish religious clothing, and vandalism against cemeteries and places of worship. The political exchanges at these meetings, as well as discussions Socialist Workers' Party members have had with working people on the job, on porches and doorsteps, and as we participate with others in protests and street actions opposing violence against Jews, underscored the need for a deeper understanding of anti-Jewish persecution and the fight against it. These conclusions have been reinforced by the anti-Semitic demagogy and activity spreading among bourgeois liberals and the middle-class left in the United States, United Kingdom, and other imperialist countries. In the UK, we've seen the deepening anti-Jewish evolution of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, while in the US, Democratic Party leaders in Congress refused to call for a vote, censuring one of their own members for making anti-Jewish slurs. The so-called boycott divestment sect. Is this a fucking pro-Zionist introduction? The so-called BDS campaign, rampant on campuses, seeks to quarantine Israel as a pariah among nations. It fucking is. Oh, God. Systematically targets those in North America, Europe, and elsewhere to do business with individuals, companies, and institutions in Israel, and organizes to exclude Israeli Jews from participation in the arts, sports, medical conferences, and university-sponsored events the world over. Because they're sadistic bastards committing a genocide. That's why. Oh god, okay, I'm skipping the fucking introduction. I am skipping the introduction. Um, okay, this is the actual book because I should say that he actually talks about Zionism towards the end. The last point of chapter 7, in other words, the second last chapter, is titled Zionism. And I know Abram was a Zionist early on, but then became a communist. This was a time when the dominant strain of Zionism was Labor Zionism, it's like socialist oriented Zionism. All right. Chapter 1. The Premises for a Scientific Study of Jewish History. The scientific study of Jewish history is yet to transcend the stage of idealist improvisation. Serious historians have boldly attacked the field of history as a whole in the spirit of Marx and have, in large measure, conquered it for the materialist outlook. Jewish history, however, still remains the chosen land of the God-seekers of every variety. It is one of the few fields of history where idealist prejudices have succeeded in entrenching and maintaining themselves to so great an extent. How many oceans of ink have been spilled to celebrate the famous miracle of the Jew? What a strange spectacle are these men who have, in order to preserve the sacred trust of their faith, braved persecutions and martyrdom, claims Bedari. The preservation of the Jews is explained by all historians as the product of their devotion through the centuries to their religion or their nationality. Differences among these historians began to appear only when it comes to defining the goal for which the Jews preserved themselves in reason for their resistance to assimilation. Some, taking the religious point of view, speak of the sacred trust of their faith. Others, like Huguenot, defend the theory of attachment to the national idea. We must seek the causes for the historical phenomenon, preservation of Jewish people in their national spiritual strength, in their ethical basis, and in the monotheistic principle, says the General Encyclopedia, which contrives in this way to reconcile the various viewpoints among the idealist historians. But while it is possible to reconcile these idealist theories with one another, it is hopeless to try to find some ground for reconciling these same theories with the elementary rules of historical science. The latter must categorically reject the fundamental error of all idealist schools, which consists of putting under the hallmark of free will the cardinal question of Jewish history, namely the preservation of the Jewish people. Only a study of the economic role played by the Jews can contribute to clarifying the causes for the miracle of the Jew. To study the evolution of this question is not exclusively of academic interest. Without a thorough study of Jewish history, it is difficult to understand the Jewish question in modern times. The plight of the Jews in the 20th century is intimately bound up with their historical past. Every social formation represents a stage in the social process. Being is only a moment in the process of becoming. In order to undertake an analysis of the Jewish question in its present phase of development, it is indispensable to know its historical roots. In the sphere of Jewish history, as in the sphere of universal history, Karl Marx's brilliant thought points the road to follow. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. Marx thus puts the Jewish question back on its feet. We must not start with religion in order to explain Jewish history. To the contrary, the preservation of the Jewish people, of the Jewish religion or nationality, can be explained only by the real Jew, that is to say, by the Jew in his economic and social position. The preservation of the Jews contains nothing of the miraculous. Judaism continues to exist not in spite of history, but owing to history. It is precisely by studying the historical function of Judaism that one is able to discover the secret of its survival in history. The struggles between Jewish and Christian society, under their respective religious guises, were in reality social struggles. The contradiction between state and a particular religion, for instance Judaism, is given by us a human form as the contradiction between the state and particular secular elements. The general pattern of Jewish history is presented, with various slight nuances, somewhat as follows, according to the reigning idealist school. Up to the destruction of Jerusalem, as late as the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, the Jewish nation was in no wise different from other normally constituted nations, such as the Roman or Greek. The wars between the Romans and the Jews resulted in dispersing the Jewish nation to four corners of the world. In the dispersion, the Jews fiercely resisted national and religious assimilation. Christianity found no more rabid adversaries in its path, and despite all its efforts, did not succeed in burning. The fall of the Roman Empire increased the isolation of Judaism, which constituted the sole heterodox element after the complete triumph of Christianity in the West. In the epoch of the barbarian invasions, the Jews of the diaspora were not at all a homogeneous social group. On the contrary, agriculture, industry, commerce were widely prevalent among them. It was the continuous religious persecution that forced them to entrench themselves increasingly in commerce and use. The Crusades, by reason of the religious fanaticism they engendered, violently accelerated this evolution, which transformed the Jews into usurers and ended in their confinement in ghettos. Of course, the hatred against the Jews was also fanned by the latter's economic role, but the historians attribute only a secondary importance to this factor. This condition of Jews continued up to the French Revolution, which destroyed the barriers religious persecution had raised against Jews. Several important facts challenge the accuracy of this picture. 1. The dispersal of the Jews does not at all date from the fall of Jerusalem. Several centuries before this event, the great majority of Jews were already spread over the four corners of the earth. It is certain that well before the fall of Jerusalem, more than three-fourths of the Jews no longer live in Palestine. For the great masses of Jews dispersed in the Greek Empire and later in the Roman Empire, the Jewish kingdom of Palestine was of completely secondary importance. The tie with the mother country was manifested solely in religious pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which played a role similar to that of Mecca in the Muslims. Shortly before the fall of Jerusalem, King Agrippa said, "There is no people upon the habitable earth who have not some portion of us among them." The diaspora was consequently not at all an accidental thing, product of acts of violence. The fundamental reason for Jewish emigration must be sought in the geographic conditions of Palestine. The Jews in Palestine were the possessors of a mountainous country that, at a certain time, no longer sufficed for assuring its inhabitants as tolerable an existence as that among their neighbours. Such a people were driven to choose between brigandage and emigration. The Scots, for example, ultimately engaged in each of these pursuits. The Jews, after numerous struggles with their neighbours, also took the second road. Peoples living under such conditions do not go to foreign countries as agriculturists. They go there rather in the role of mercenaries, like the Arcadians of antiquity, the Swiss in the Middle Ages, the Albanians in our day, or in the role of merchants, like Jews, the Scots, the Armenians. We see here that a similar environment tends to produce similar characteristics among peoples of different races. 2. The overwhelming majority of Jews of the diaspora unquestionably engaged in trade. Palestine itself, since very remote times, was a passageway for commodities, a bridge between the valleys of the Euphrates and the Nile. Syria was the inevitable highway of the conquerors. Trade and ideas followed the same route. It is easy to see that from a very early date, these regions were thickly populated and possessed great cities whose very situation lent itself to commerce. The geographic conditions of Palestine therefore explain both the Jewish emigration and its commercial character. On the other hand, among all nations, at the beginning of their development, the traders are foreigners. The characteristic of a natural economy is that each sphere produces everything consumed by it and consumes everything it produces. There is consequently no pressure to buy goods or services from others, because what is produced is consumed in this economy. We find among all these peoples that the first traders are foreigners. Philo, 15 BC to 45 AD, enumerates many cities where the Jews were established as traders. He states that they inhabited countless cities in Europe, Asia, in Libya, on the mainland and in the islands, along the coasts and in the interior. The Jews who inhabited the Hellenic islands, as well as the mainland further to the west, had installed themselves there with commercial objectives. As well as the Syrians, the Jews were to be found in all the cities, living in small communities. They were sailors, brokers, bankers, whose influence was as essential in the economic life of the time as was the Oriental influence, which made itself felt at the same time in the art and religious thought of that period. It is to their social position that the Jews are beholden for the wide autonomy granted them by the Roman emperors. Only the Jews were allowed to form, so to speak, a state within a state. And while the other foreigners were ruled by local authorities, the Jews, up to a certain point, were allowed to govern themselves. Caesar, ruled 46 to 44 BC, advanced the interests of Jews in Alexandria and in Rome by special favors and privileges, and protected in particular their peculiar worship against the Roman as well as against the Greek local priests. 3. Hatred for the Jews does not date solely from the birth of Christianity. Seneca treated the Jews as a criminal race. Juvenal believed that the Jews existed only to cause evil for other peoples. Quintilian said that the Jews were a curse for other people. The cause of ancient antisemitism is the same as for medieval antisemitism. The antagonism between the merchant in every society, based principally on the production of use values. Medieval hostility towards the merchants is not solely of Christian or pseudo-Christian inspiration, it also has a real pagan source. The latter was strongly rooted in a class ideology, in the disdain that the leading classes of Roman society, the senatorial aristocracy, as well as the provincial curia, felt out of a deep peasant tradition toward all forms of economic activity other than those deriving from agriculture. However, while anti-Semitism was already strongly developed in Roman society, the condition of the Jews, as we have seen, was quite enviable there. The hostility of classes that live from the land or trade does not eliminate their dependence upon the latter. The landowner hates and despises the merchant, but he cannot get along without them. The triumph of Christianity did not bring any notable changes in this. Christianity, at first the religion of the slaves and the downtrodden, was rapidly transformed to an ideology of the ruling class of landed proprietors. It was Constantine the Great, ruled 306 to 337, who laid the foundation for medieval serfdom. The triumphal march of Christianity across Europe was accompanied by an extension of feudal economy. The religious orders played an extremely important role in the progress of civilization, which consisted in that epoch of developing agriculture on the basis of serfdom. There is little astonishing in the fact that, born in Judaism, formed at first exclusively of Jews, Christianity nevertheless, nowhere during the first 4 centuries, found more difficulty than among them in acquiring partisans for its doctrine. As a matter of fact, Christian mentality during the first 10 centuries of our era viewed everything connected with economic life from the basic standpoint that a merchant can with difficulty do work pleasing to God, and that all trade implies a greater or lesser amount of cheating. The life of the Jews appeared completely incomprehensible to St. Ambrose, who lived in the 4th century. He despised the wealth of the Jews profoundly, and firmly believed that they would be punished for it by eternal damnation. There's a quote here. The Jews historically are a group with a specific economic function, a people class. Because they've remained a social class, they've also kept certain religious, ethnic, and linguistic traits. The fierce hostility of the Jews toward Catholicism and their determination to preserve a religion that admirably expressed their social interests are therefore quite natural. It is not the loyalty of the Jews to their faith that explains their preservation as a distinct social group. On the contrary, it is their preservation as a distinct social group that explains their attachment to their faith. Nevertheless, like the hostility in antiquity toward the Jews, Christian antisemitism never went to the extreme of demanding the annihilation of Judaism. Whereas official Christianity mercilessly persecuted paganism and heresies, it tolerated Jewish religion. The condition of the Jews continued to improve during the decline of the Roman Empire, after the complete triumph of Christianity, and up to the 12th century. The more economic decay deepened, all the more did the commercial role of the Jews grow in importance. In the 10th century, they constituted the sole economic link in Europe and Asia. It is only from the 12th century on, parallel with the economic development of Western Europe, the growth of cities, and the formation of a native commercial and industrial class, that the condition of the Jews begins to worsen seriously, leading to their almost complete elimination from most of the Western countries. Persecutions of the Jews take on increasingly violent forms. As against this, in the backward countries of Eastern Europe, their condition continued to flourish up until a fairly recent period. From these few preliminary considerations, we can see how false is the general conception prevailing in the sphere of Jewish history. Above all, the Jews are historically a social group with specific economic function. They are a class, or more precisely, a people class. The concept of class does not at all contradict the concept of people. It is because the Jews have preserved themselves as a social class that they have likewise retained certain of their religious, ethnic, and linguistic traits. This identification of a class with a people or race is far from being exceptional in free capitalist societies. Social classes were then frequently distinguished by a more or less national or racial character. The higher and lower classes are in many countries the lineal representatives of the peoples conquering and the peoples conquered of an anterior epoch. The race of the invaders formed a military nobility, the invaded race, not living by the sword, but by the compulsory labor of their hands. Kautsky speaks in the same vein. Different classes may assume the character of different races. On the other hand, the meeting of many races, each developing an occupation of its own, may lead to their taking up various callings or social positions within the same community. Race becomes class. I will just intercept here that I think by race is being more accurately meant ethnicity. Race is a social construct. There is evidently a continuous interdependence between racial or national and class characteristics. The social position of the Jews has had a profound determining influence on their national character. There is no contradiction in this idea of a people class, and it is even easier to show the correspondence between class and religion. Whenever a class attains a certain degree of maturity and consciousness, its opposition to the ruling class takes on religious forms. The heresies of the Albigenses, the Lollards, the Manichaeans, The Cathari and other innumerable sects that swarmed in medieval cities were the initial religious manifestations of the growing opposition to the feudal order by the bourgeoisie and the people as a whole. These heresies nowhere reached the level of a dominant religion because of the relative weakness of the medieval bourgeoisie. They were savagely drowned in blood. It was only in the 17th century that the bourgeoisie, increasing in power, was able to bring about the triumph of Lutheranism and, above all, of Calvinism and its English equivalents. Whereas Catholicism expresses the interests of the landed nobility and of the feudal order, while Calvinism or Puritanism represents those of the bourgeoisie or capitalism, Judaism mirrors the interests of a pre-capitalist mercantile class. I would also probably say here as well that the radical reformation that took place very much expressed the interests of the peasantry, primarily the poor peasantry, Anabaptists and similar groups like that. Most of them were pacifists. Some of them were violent. Catholicism was like a feudal thing. Calvinism or Protestantism more broadly was bourgeois, and the Radical Reformation, Anabaptism, was very much a peasant-based ideology, or version of Christianity. And then, interesting, the Judean stuff there. Let's continue. What primarily distinguishes Jewish capitalism from genuine capitalism is that, by contrast with the latter, it is not the bearer of a new mode of production. Here we have commercial capital in its pure form, quite separate from the extremes, spheres of production between which it mediates. The trading peoples of old existed like the gods of Epicurus in the intermundia, or like the Jews in the Polish society. Usury, just like trade, exploits a given mode of production, but does not create it. Both relate to the mode of production from outside. The accumulation of money in the hands of the Jews did not arise from a special mode of production, from capitalist production. Surplus value, or surplus product, came from feudal exploitation, and the lords were obliged to yield part of this surplus value to Jews. Hence the antagonism between the Jews and feudalism, and hence likewise and the indestructible bond between them. As for the Lord, so too for the Jew, feudalism was Mother Earth. If the Lord needed the Jew also had need of the Lord. It is by reason of this social position that the Jews were nowhere able to rise to the role of a ruling class. In the feudal economy, the role of a merchant class could only be a clearly subordinate one. Judaism could only remain a more or less tolerated cult. We have already seen that the Jews in antiquity had jurisdiction over their own community. The same was true in the Middle Ages. In the developing society of the Middle Ages, each class of men lived according to its own customs and under its special jurisdiction. Outside the judicial organization of the state, the church had its ecclesiastical courts, the nobility its feudal courts, and the peasants their manorial courts. The burghers, in their turn, obtained their municipal courts. The specific organization of the Jews was the Kehillah. Each cluster of Jews was organized into a community, Kehillah, that lived its own social life and had its own juridical organization. It was in Poland that this organization attained its highest degree of perfection. According to an ordinance issued by King Sigismund II, 1551, the Jews had the right to choose judges and rabbis whose duty it was to administer all their affairs. Only in actions between Jews and non-Jews did the voivode courts, administrative courts presided over by the Lord or his appointee, intervene. Each Jewish community was free to choose community council. The activities of this council, called Kahal, were extensive. It collected taxes for the state, apportioned the general and special taxes, directed the elementary schools and high schools, yeshiva. It had jurisdiction over all questions concerning trade, artisanry, charity. It took care of settling conflicts between members of the community. The power of each Kahal extended to the Jewish inhabitants of surrounding villages. With time, the various councils, Jewish communities made a practice of assembling regionally at regular intervals to discuss administrative, juridical, and religious questions. These assemblies thus assumed the aspect of miniature parliaments. On the occasion of the Great Fair of Lublin, a sort of general parliament assembled in which the representatives of Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, Podolia, and Volhynia participated. This parliament was called Vad Arba Aradzot, or the Council of the Four Lands. Traditional Jewish historians had not failed to discern a form of national autonomy in this organization. In Old Poland, says Dubnov, the Jews were a nation having autonomy with its own internal administration, courts, and a certain juridical independence. Clearly, it is a gross anachronism to speak of national autonomy in the 16th century. This epoch knew nothing of the national question. In feudal society, only the classes had their special jurisdictions. Jewish autonomy is to be explained by the specific social and economic position of the Jews, and not at all by their nationality. Their linguistic evolution also reflects the specific social position of the Jews. Hebrew disappeared very early as a living language. The Jews everywhere adopted the languages of the peoples among whom they lived. But this linguistic adaptation generally occurred in the form of a new dialect, in which we again find some Hebraic expressions. There existed at various times in history Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Evenko, Judeo-Portuguese, Judeo-Spanish, and other dialects, including, of course, Judeo-German, which has become present-day Yiddish. The dialect thus expresses the two contradictory tendencies that have characterized Jewish life: the tendency to integration in surrounding society and the tendency to isolation, deriving from the socio-economic situation of Jewry. It is only where the Jews cease constituting a special social group that have become completely assimilated in the surrounding society. Assimilation is no new phenomenon in Jewish history, states the Zionist sociologist Ruppert. In reality, while Jewish history is the history of the preservation of Judaism, it is at the same time the history of assimilation of large sections of Jews. In northern Africa, pre-Islamic times, great numbers of Jews were engaged in agriculture, but of these too, the vast majority have been absorbed by the local population. This assimilation is explained by the fact that the Jews, by becoming peasants, ceased being a separate class. Could they at all have taken to agriculture? They could hardly have done so without scattering through the country and its numerous villages, which, in spite of the difference in religion, would probably in a few generations have resulted in complete assimilation. Engaged in commerce and concentrated in towns, they formed agglomerations and developed a social life of their own, moving and marrying within their own community. Let us also recall the numerous conversions of Jewish landed foreigners in Germany in the 4th century. The complete disappearance of the Jewish warrior tribes of Arabia, the assimilation of the Jews in South America, Suriname, then Dutch Guiana, etc. The law of assimilation might be formulated as follows. Wherever the Jews cease being a class, they lose, more or less rapidly, their ethnic, religious, and linguistic characteristics. They become assimilated. It is very hard to trace Jewish history in Europe at several important periods because the economic, social, and political conditions were so different in various countries. Whereas Poland and the Ukraine were completely feudal at the end of the 18th century, in Western Europe, we witness an accelerated development of capitalism during this same period. It is easy to understand that the situation of the Jews in Poland bore far more resemblance to the situation of the French Jews in the Carolingian era, 750 to 900, than to that of their co-religionists in Bordeaux or Paris. The Portuguese Jew of Bordeaux and the German Jew of Metz are two absolutely different beings, wrote a French Jew to Voltaire. The rich bourgeois Jews of France or Holland had virtually nothing in common with the Polish Jews who constituted a class in feudal society. Despite the marked differences in conditions and in the tempo of economic development of the various European countries inhabited by the Jews, a careful study permits the delineation of the following main stages of their history. A. Pre-capitalist period. This was also the period of the greatest prosperity of the Jews. Commercial and usurious capital found great possibilities for expansion in society. The Jews were protected by the kings and princes, and their relations with other classes were in general good. This situation lasted up to the 11th century in Western Europe. The Carolingian epoch, the culminating point of feudal development, was also the apex of Jewish prosperity. Feudal economy continued to dominate Eastern Europe till the end of the 18th century, and the center of Jewish life shifted more and more to that area. B. Period of medieval capitalism. From the 11th century on, Western Europe entered a period of intensive economic development. The first stage of this evolution was characterized by the creation of a guild-based industry and a native merchant bourgeoisie. The penetration of the commodity economy into the agricultural domain determined the second stage. The growth of cities and of a native merchant class brought with it the complete elimination of the Jews from commerce. They became usurers whose principal clientele consisted of the nobility and the kings. But the mercantile transformation of agricultural economy undermined these positions as well. The relative abundance of money enabled the nobility to throw off the yoke of the usurer. The Jews were driven from one country after another. Others became assimilated, being absorbed mainly by the native bourgeoisie. In certain cities, principally in Germany and in Italy, the Jews became primarily loan makers to the popular masses, the peasants and the artisans. In this role, as petty usurers exploiting the people, they were often the victims of bloody uprisings. In general, the period of medieval capitalism was that of the most violent Jewish persecutions. Jewish capital came into conflict with all classes of society. But the unevenness of economic development in the Western European countries operated to alter the forms of anti-Semitic struggles. In one country, it was the nobility that directly struggled against the Jews. In others, it was the bourgeoisie. And in Germany, it was the people who unleashed the movement. Medieval capitalism was practically unknown in Eastern Europe. There was no separation between merchants' capital and usurious capital. In contrast to Western Europe, where Jew became synonymous with usurer, the Jews in Eastern Europe remained mainly traders and middlemen. Whereas the Jews were increasingly eliminated from the countries of the West, they constantly strengthened their position in Eastern Europe. It was only in the 19th century that the development of capitalism, it is no longer guild-based capitalism this time, but modern capitalism, which appears on the scene, began to undermine the prosperous condition of the Russian and Polish Jews. The poverty of the Jews in Russia dates only from the abolition of serfdom and of the feudal regime in ruling property. So long as the former and the latter existed, the Jews found wide possibilities for subsisting as merchants and middlemen. C. Period of manufacture and industrial capitalism. The capitalist period, roughly speaking, began in the epoch of the Renaissance and manifested itself at first by a tremendous expansion of commerce and the growth of manufactures. To the extent that the Jews survived in Western Europe, and only a few were left there, they took part in the development of capitalism. But the theory of Sombart, who attributes a decisive activity to them, the development of capitalism, belongs to the sphere of fantasy. Precisely because the Jews represented a primitive capitalism, mercantile and usurious, the development of modern capitalism would only prove fatal to their social position. This fact does not at all exclude, far from it, the individual participation of the Jews in the creation of modern capitalism. But wherever the Jews were integrated into the capitalist class, there they were likewise assimilated. The Jew, as a great entrepreneur or stakeholder of the Dutch or English India Company, was already on the threshold of baptism, a threshold, moreover, that he crossed with the greatest ease. The progress of capitalism went hand in hand with the assimilation of the Jews in Western Europe. If Judaism did not completely disappear in the West, it was owing to the mass influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. The Jewish question, which is now posed on a world scale, therefore results primarily from the situation of Eastern Jews. This situation is, in turn, a product of the lag in economic development of this part of the world. The special causes of Jewish immigration are thus linked with the general causes behind the immigration movement of the 19th century. The general immigration of the 19th century was caused in large measure by the failure of capitalist development to keep pace with the crumbling of the feudal and artisan. The ranks of the English peasants, evicted by the capitalization of rural economy, were swelled by the small-scale production workers displaced by machines. These peasant and artisan masses, eliminated by the new economic system, were driven to seek a livelihood across the ocean. But this situation was not definitely prolonged because of the rapid development of the productive forces in Western Europe. The section of the population deprived of its means of subsistence was soon able to find sufficient work in industry. That is why, in Germany, for instance, emigration to America, which was very strong in the middle of the 19th century, dwindled almost completely toward the end of the century. Same applies to England and other countries of Western Europe. While the imbalance between the crumbling of feudalism and the development of capitalism was disappearing in Western Europe, it was growing worse in the backward Eastern European countries. The destruction of feudal economy and primitive forms of capitalism proceeded there much more rapidly than the development of modern capitalism. Increasingly greater masses of peasants and artisans had to seek their road of salvation in emigration. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was principally the English, the Irish, Germans, and the Scandinavians who formed the bulk of immigrants to America. The Slavic and Jewish element became dominant toward the end of the 19th century among the masses streaming to the New World. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Jewish masses sought new roads of immigration. But at first it was toward the interior of Russia and Germany that they headed. The Jews succeeded in penetrating the great industrial and commercial centers, where they played an important role as merchants and industrialists. Here we come upon a new and important fact. For the first time in centuries, a Jewish proletariat was born. The people class began to differentiate socially. The Jewish proletariat, however, remained concentrated mainly in the sector of consumer goods industry. It was primarily of the artisan type. In the same measure as large-scale industry expanded its field of exploitation, the artisan branches of economy declined. The workshop was superseded by the factory, and it thus turned out that the integration of Jews into capitalist economy still remained extremely precarious. It was not alone the pre-capitalist merchant who was forced to emigrate, but also the Jewish artisan worker. Jewish masses streamed in ever larger numbers from Eastern Europe to the West and to America. The solution of the Jewish question, that is to say, the complete absorption of the Jews into economic life, thus became a world problem. D. The decline of capitalism. By socially differentiating Jews, by integrating latter into economic life, and by emigration, capitalism has laid bases for the solution of the Jewish problem. But capitalism has failed to solve it. On the contrary, the fearsome crisis of the capitalist regime in the 20th century has aggravated the plight of the Jews to an unparalleled degree. The Jews, driven from their economic positions under feudalism, could not be integrated into the capitalist economy in utter decay. In its convulsions, capitalism casts out even those Jewish elements that it has not yet completely assimilated. Multiplying everywhere is the savage anti-Semitism of the middle classes, who are being choked to death under the weight of capitalist contradictions. Big capital exploits this elemental anti-Semitism of the petty bourgeoisie in order to mobilize the masses around the banner of racism. The Jews are being strangled between the jaws of two systems, feudalism and capitalism, each feeding the rottenness of the other. All right. That is chapter 1. Done. well stuff. This is long. Okay. Um, ooh, okay. I will probably not get through all of this. Not a chance. Chapter 2. From Antiquity to the Carolingian Epoch, the period of commercial prosperity of the Jews. A. Before the Roman conquest. From a very remote time, Syria and Palestine were the highways for the exchange of goods between the two oldest centers of culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, Egypt and Assyria. The essentially commercial character of the Phoenicians and Canaanites was a product of the geographical and historical situation of the countries they inhabited. The Phoenicians became the first great commercial people of antiquity because they were located between the first two great centers of civilization. It was Assyrian and Egyptian goods that at first constituted the main object of Phoenician trade. The same was certainly true for the Palestinian merchants. According to Herodotus, Assyrian goods were the most ancient and most important articles of Phoenician commerce. No less ancient, however, was the connection of the Phoenicians with Egypt. The legends of biblical Canaan, as well as Phoenician myths, reveal continuous relations by land and by sea between the inhabitants of these countries and the Egyptians. Herodotus also speaks of Egyptian goods that the Phoenicians had been bringing to Greece from very remote times. But if the geographical situation of Palestine was as favorable as that of Phoenicia for mercantile trade in Egypt and Assyria, the facilities for navigation and disposal of Syria were completely lacking in Palestine. Phoenicia was abundantly providing everything necessary for sea travel. The cedar and cypress of Lebanon furnished it with timber. Copper and iron were also plentiful in the mountains of Lebanon, surrounding areas. On the Phoenician coast, many natural ports were available for navigation. It is therefore not surprising that at a very early date, Phoenician ships, heavily laden with Egyptian and Assyrian products, should have begun to ply the navigable routes of the ancient world. The political and trade relations of Phoenicia with great states of the Nile and the Euphrates, relations established more than 2,000 years before Christ, permitted the expansion of Phoenician trade to the coastal countries of the ocean. The Phoenicians brought the most diversified peoples and civilizations of antiquity closer together. For many centuries, the Phoenicians maintained a monopoly of trade between the relatively developed countries of the East and the less civilized countries of the West. In the era of the commercial hegemony of the Phoenicians, the islands, Western Mediterranean countries bordering it, were economically still very backward. This does not mean that trade was unknown to the society of the day, Homeric society, but for the Greeks it consisted essentially of importation. In payment for these purchases were raw or precious materials for manufactured goods, which the foreign navigators came to offer them. the Greeks seem to have chiefly given cattle. This situation, so highly disadvantageous for the natives, was not long maintained. Phoenician commerce itself became one of the principal stimulants for the economic development of Greece. The rise of Greece was also favored by Hellenic colonization, which expanded greatly between the 9th and 7th century before Christ. The Greek colonists spread in all directions over the Mediterranean. Greek cities multiplied. Thucydides and Plato attribute the Greek immigration to the shortage of land. The development of Greek colonization was accompanied by a tremendous rise, at least for that era, in Hellenic industry and commerce. This economic development of Greece inevitably brought about the commercial decline of Phoenicia. In the past, the Phoenicians had landed their goods at the Greek anchorages and had exchanged them against products of the area, usually, it seems, cattle. Henceforth, the Greek mariners would themselves go to Egypt, Syria, to Asia Minor, and among the peoples of Europe, the civilized Etruscans and the barbaric Scythians, Gauls, Ligurians, and Iberians, taking with them manufactured goods and works of art, fabric, weapons, jewelry, and paint urns, which had a great reputation and were eagerly bought by all the barbarians. The period extending from the 6th to the 4th century appears to have been the era of the economic high point of Greece. The characteristic of this new period was that the professions had become more numerous, organized, specialized. The division of labor had been greatly developed. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Hipponikos had 600 slaves working in his mines, and Nicias 1,000 in his. This important economic development of Greece has stimulated most bourgeois scholars to speak about a Greek capitalism. They go so far as to compare Hellenic industry and trade with the vast economic movement of the modern industrial era. In reality, agriculture continued to be the economic foundation of Greece and its colonies. The Greek colony was not a trading colony. It was practically invariably military and agricultural. Thus, Strabo relates Propos of Cumae, a Greek colony in Italy, that it was not until 300 years after settling there that the inhabitants noticed that their city was located in the sea. The essentially agricultural character of the economic life of the Hellenic world is incontestable. Nor can there be any question of an industry comparable to modern industry. The methods of production and of organization remained on the artisan level. Only the mines seem to have presented, at least insofar as labor power is concerned, a picture similar to that which we see at the present time. The fact that despite their great expansion, industry and commerce remained for the most part in the hands of metics or foreigners proves best their relatively subordinate role in Greek economy. In the immense trade of which Athens is the center, as well as in its industry, the metics play a preponderant role. And at Delos, the great commercial center, At Delos, the great commercial center, the inscriptions show that almost all the traders were foreigners. The Greek citizen despised trade and industry. He was primarily a landed provider. Aristotle, unlike Plato, was opposed to granting citizenship to merchants. It is therefore necessary to guard against exaggerating the importance of the industrial and commercial development of Greece. In fact, the Greek expansion was primarily agricultural and military. It did, however, go hand in hand with the industrial and commercial development of considerable importance for its time. The Greeks never became a commercial people like the Phoenicians and the Jews, but we do find a very important commercial and industrial development of Greek colonies and later in the Hellenic kingdoms. And of course, the Greek states, while not really engaged in trade themselves, supported commerce and industry with all their might as financial sources of the utmost importance. It is not solely to the economic development of Greece and its colonies that we must attribute the decline of Phoenician commerce. There was still another important cause: growing antagonism between Persia and Greece. Paralleling the extension of Hellenic civilization was the victorious march of the Persians across Asia. The Persian Empire reached its peak in the 5th century BC. It extended over a part of Asia and over Egypt. The parallel development of Greek and Persian civilization necessarily dealt a mortal blow to Phoenician commerce. Trade between Asia and Europe was certainly rendered very difficult by the division of the Mediterranean world between two mutually hostile societies. The Persian and Greek worlds each created their own commercial trade. With the decline of Phoenicia and the development of Asiatic trade after the period of the Persian conquests, we can assume that Palestine, previously completely supplanted by Phoenicia, again began to play an important commercial role. The passageway between Egypt and Babylonia recovered all its value, whereas Phoenician trade lost more and more of its ancient importance, to the point where, in the time of Lucian, 2nd century AD, salted products were the main cargo, and the Jews played a leading role in the Persian Empire. Certain historians attribute an important role to the Babylonian exile in the transformation of the Jews into a commercial people. In Babylonia, the Jews became transformed into a commercial people, such as we know them in the economic history of the world. They found highly developed economic relations among the Babylonians. Recently uncovered cuneiform texts show that the exiled Jews participated actively in commercial life. They were involved in credit businesses, highly developed among the Babylonians. They were also big traders. But the dispersion of the Jews is certainly prior to the Babylonian exile, 6th century BC. There are serious reasons for conceding the existence of a pre-exile diaspora. The scope of the Jewish elite exile under the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar is very greatly exaggerated. Only a part of the ruling classes was hit by the king's measures. The majority of the Jews established in Palestine continued to live there. Consequently, if during the Persian epoch the Jews were to be found spread all over all parts of that enormous empire, and the book of Esther is very eloquent on this subject, it would be childish to view this fact as a consequence of the Babylonian exile, an exile that lasted altogether some 50 years. It is equally childish to believe that the Jewish people returned to Palestine in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, 5th century BC, whose work was primarily of a religious character. It was a matter of rebuilding the temple and of reconstructing a religious metropolis for dispersed Judaism. Most historians have considerably exaggerated the role of Palestinian Jews in the Epoch. They reason as if when Jerusalem was restored, all the history of Israel became concentrated around the Holy Mountain, as if all the people had really returned from exile and had lived on a land measuring some few hundred square kilometers between Tekoa, Mitzvah, and Jericho. In reality, in this epoch, the Jews of Judea represented only a part and the smallest of the Jewish people, and undoubtedly it was the least vibrant part. The Edict of Cyrus, 538 BC, is addressed to the Jews of the diaspora in the following words: "And whosoever is left in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of that place help those who are going to Palestine with silver and with gold and with goods and with feasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And all they that were round about them," continues the book of Ezra 1:6. The previous quote was book of Ezra 1:4. Strengthened their hands, the 42,000 Jews who were returning to Palestine, with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with feasts. It is obvious that we are not dealing here with a mass return of Jews to Palestine, but primarily with the reconstruction of the temple. During the Persian Empire, the principal colonies of the diaspora were situated in Mesopotamia, in Chaldea, and in Egypt. The documents that have been found at Elephantine in Egypt, dating from the 5th century before Christ, throw an interesting light on the condition of the Jewish colonies of the diaspora in this epoch. According to the archives belonging to a Jewish family, it appears that the Jews engaged in trade, bought and sold houses and land, lent money, acted as depositories, and were well versed in matters of law. It is very interesting to note that even the Psalms and Chronicles are in Aramaic, which shows that as early as the 5th century BC, Hebrew was no longer a customary language for Jews. Aramaic was the greatest Asiatic language in the period, the commercial language. The religion of the Jews of Elephantine was not as developed as the official religion codified during the Ezra-Nehemiah era. In a petition to the Persian governor, they asked for authorization to rebuild their temple, but the reform of Ezra and Nehemiah was aimed precisely at concentrating all the Jews of the diaspora around the single temple at Jerusalem. And it was, in fact, to Jerusalem that the gifts of the Jews dispersed throughout the world continued to flow up to the year 70. It was this wealth of the Temple of Jerusalem that was probably the principal reason for the offensive of Antiochus against the Jews. Simon advised him that the public treasury in Jerusalem was full of large sums and that there were enormous public riches. Second book of the Maccabees, 6. Later, on the little island of Kos, Mithridates confiscated 800 talents that were destined for the Temple of Jerusalem. In the Roman era, Cicero complained in his speeches of the immense sums that were flowing to Jerusalem. The Hellenistic period, 323 to 30 BC, is the epoch of the economic high point of antiquity. The conquests of Alexander destroyed the barriers between the Hellenic world with Asia and Egypt. Cities sprang up like mushrooms in all parts of the Hellenic Empire. The greatest founders of cities, not alone of this epoch, but even in all history, was Seleucus I and his son Antiochus I. The Hellenistic kings created new urban centers destined to supplant the old Phoenician and Persian cities. On the coast of Syria, the port of Antioch causes the old cities of Tyre and Sidon to be forgotten. Seleucus creates Seleucia on the banks of the Tigris in order to rob Babylonia of its central role in world commerce. This goal was completely attained. Whereas Babylonia fell into decline, Hellenic Seleucia probably became the greatest city of the seaboard. According to Pliny, it had 600,000 inhabitants. Alongside of Seleucia, Alexandria, and Antioch became the centers of the Hellenistic world. All of these cities experienced an unchallenged prosperity during the Hellenistic period. The situation of the Jews appears to have been further strengthened after the conquests of Alexander. It appears that they were able to secure special privileges equally well, both from the Seleucidae and from the Lagidae, the dynasty in Egypt that began with King Ptolemy I, 366 to 282 BC. In Alexandria, to which they had been attracted by Ptolemy I, and where they abounded, they formed a separate community that governed itself and was not subject to the jurisdiction of the Greek courts. The Jews enjoyed a certain autonomy and a privileged position in Antioch, the capital of Syria. This was also true in Cyrene. The privileged position and the specific economic roles of the Jews had already become the source of serious conflict with the population of the cities they inhabited. Struggles broke out continuously in the Palestinian cities, as well as in Alexandria, Seleucia, Cyrene, and Cyprus. These conflicts had nothing in common with present-day national antagonisms. On the contrary, the Hellenistic empires witnessed a tremendous assimilation of their component peoples. The name Greek ceased after a while to be applied to the members of a particular nation, but was assigned to the ruling and cultured sections of the population. An ancient writer tells us Alexander ordered everybody to consider the world as his fatherland, the people of goodwill as his kin, and evildoers as foreigners. The increased importance of Jews in the commercial life of the Hellenistic world must also be attributed to the displacement of economic life to the east. The prosperity of Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia offers a striking contrast to the poverty and decay into which Greece has fallen in the same period. Polybius repeatedly stresses the decline of Greek cities. Somewhat later, in the 2nd century BC, visitors could hardly believe that this city, where water was scarce, the streets badly laid out, the houses uncomfortable, was the famous Athens. Athens was shorn of its role as the center of the civilized world. What contributed to the ruin of Greece, besides her economic decline, was the ceaseless class struggles, which by virtue of the backward mode of production would bring about no important changes. The victories of the plebeians were ephemeral. The redistribution of wealth would only wind up in new social inequalities, creating centers of new social conflicts. Thus, the triumph of Greece after the conquests of Alexander proved illusory. The displacement of the economic center of the world toward the east, which followed the conquests, brought about the rapid decline of Greece. The propertied and aristocratic classes, powerless before the plebeian revolts, had to seek support from Rome, but the latter would only answer by dealing the final blow to Greece as well as to Hellenism. The Romans threw themselves on the Hellenistic world as on a convenient prey to be pillaged and conquered. Between 211 and 208 BC, according to the assuredly very incomplete information that has come down to us, the 5 old cities of the Hellenes were sacked. Corinth, the rich commercial city, was destroyed. I was there, recounts Polybius. I saw paintings trampled underfoot and soldiers sitting on them while throwing dice. Rome also dealt very harsh blows to Hellenism in Asia. Under the combined blows of the Romans and the Parthians, magnificent structure of these was destroyed. I am going to finish up for tonight. I have to go. Let me check. Need to do some shopping, but if they are already closed. Damn it. Okay. It's okay. Let me just see. I still might leave it here for tonight. That was chapter 2a. The next part is titled Roman Imperialism and Its Decline. First section was, before the Roman conquest, and B, it's Roman Imperialism and Its Decline. And then there is plenty more where that came from. There's certainly a lot to go through. So yeah, I will continue this book next Saturday. We continue. Next Tuesday, I will, of course, be continuing Vladimir Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And next Thursday, I will continue playing Carol's story in Freedom Pop on the gaming stream. So, that's where I'm going to leave things tonight. And I will continue this next Saturday. I will see you guys next time.